Russia stopped building this aircraft in 1992. Every single one still flying today is a survivor from a production line that shut down before some of the pilots flying it were even born. There is no factory left standing that can build another. There is no replacement waiting in a hangar somewhere. When one of these bombers dies, it does not get replaced. It just stops existing permanently, and the fleet gets one aircraft smaller forever. On the night of July 16th, one of them did exactly that, and the weapon that killed it cost less than a used car. 800 kilometers from the nearest point of Ukrainian territory, on a parking apron at Engels-2 Air Base, a Tu-95 sat exactly where it had sat for weeks, rotating through routine maintenance and crew training alongside a second aircraft just like it. Engels was not some forgotten outpost. It is the heart of Russia's long-range aviation, home base for the Tu-95 and Tu-160 fleets that carry Kh-101 cruise missiles into Ukrainian cities from far outside the reach of any conventional frontline defense. Everyone at that base understood exactly what was parked on that tarmac and exactly what losing any part of it would mean. Distance was supposed to be the protection. 800 kilometers is not a stretch most weapons cover casually. This was not most weapons. The Batyar is built from wood, fiberglass, and a simple engine, designed by Ukrainian engineers around one core idea. A strike weapon does not need to be expensive to be effective. It only needs to be cheap enough to lose in large numbers, and accurate enough that losing most of them still leaves a handful reaching exactly where they were sent. Against a target as large and imposing looking as a strategic bomber, that trade-off sounds almost laughable on paper. It stopped sounding laughable the moment engineers worked out that size and armor are not the same thing, and a machine designed in the 1950s was never built to survive a modern precision strike landing anywhere near its control surfaces or fuel systems, no matter how much metal makes up the rest of its silhouette. 12 of them were heading for Engels that night. Only 6 carried explosives. The other 6 carried nothing at all beyond the exact radar and visual signature needed to look, for a few critical seconds, like a real threat. That split was not padding. It was the entire strategy. Every decoy Russian air defense had to treat as real cost something: a missile, a fire control cycle, a few seconds of attention pulled away from the drone that actually mattered, while doing nothing at all to reduce the real threat still closing behind it. And the 12 drones aimed at Engels were never flying alone. They were one small piece of something far larger. More than 400 drones launched simultaneously across 18 separate Russian regions that same night, an operation built specifically to overload every layer of Russian air defense at once. A network size to handle a serious, containable number of threats does not scale its decision-making speed just because the number of contacts on every screen in the country multiplied overnight by a factor of 100. 18 regions meant 18 separate defense networks, each one forced to fight its own battle independently, with no guarantee that whatever Engels needed most that night hadn't already been spent defending somewhere else entirely. Think about what that actually demands of a country trying to defend against it. Command staff somewhere in Moscow or wherever the coordinating headquarters for that night sat had to make real-time decisions about which of 18 simultaneous regional threats deserved priority, knowing that every minute spent reinforcing one region was a minute not spent reinforcing another, and knowing that the attacker on the other end of this equation had already chosen, in advance, exactly which of those 18 fights actually mattered to them, and which were simply there to make the other 17 look equally urgent. Defending everywhere at once against an attacker who only needs one specific place to succeed is not a fair fight. Mathematically, no matter how much total interceptor capacity a country has stockpiled in warehouses somewhere. To understand why Russia still believed this base was defensible going into that night, it helps to rewind roughly 13 months to an operation that should have already ended that confidence for good. Operation Spiderweb, in June of the previous year, reached deep inside Russia using a completely different method. Drones smuggled in piece by piece, hidden inside modified cargo trucks, driven openly across Russian territory to positions near multiple air bases before ever launching. That single coordinated strike damaged or destroyed dozens of Russian aircraft across several bases at once, a result so significant that Russia spent the following year convinced, publicly and loudly, that nothing built around that specific infiltration method could ever be repeated at the same scale again. Russia was right about that much. It also completely missed the actual lesson. In the months after Spiderweb, Russia expanded parking infrastructure at bases like Engels, added dispersal bays to spread aircraft further apart, and increased patrols specifically watching for smuggled ground launches. Satellite analysts tracking the base over the following year documented exactly this shift: wider spacing between parked bombers, new bays under construction, the visible signature of a country genuinely trying to close the gap Spiderweb had exposed. Every change addressed the method Spiderweb had used. None of it addressed the far more basic fact underneath all of it. Russia's most irreplaceable aircraft still had to sit somewhere in the open, on a tarmac, visible from directly overhead, for however long maintenance and crew rotation actually required. Spiderweb proved that vulnerability existed. It never required the same method to exploit it a second time. So on the night of July 16th, it didn't use the same method at all. Russian Pantsir systems around Engels did their job in the way that job gets measured on any ordinary night. They caught contacts, engaged them, and shot down several of the 12 drones inbound. That is a real result, and against a smaller, simpler raid, it would likely have been the entire story. Against 12 drones deliberately split between 6 that mattered and 6 built purely to look like they mattered, all arriving as part of a raid stretched across 18 regions competing for the exact same finite pool of attention and interceptors. One armed Batyar found precisely the gap that volume and deception exist to create. It reached the parking apron. It closed on the 295 sitting there, stationary, with nowhere to go and no time to get there even if it had somewhere to run. And it struck the tail. Not the cockpit, not the engines, not the wide expanse of fuselage that makes up most of an aircraft this size. The tail, where the 295's control surfaces and a meaningful share of its overall structural integrity are concentrated into one comparatively small, mechanically critical section. The explosion tore that section away from the rest of the airframe entirely. Cleanly enough that satellite imagery released in the days afterward showed it in stark, unmistakable detail. A fuselage that looked, from a distance, largely intact, sitting next to its own severed tail a short distance away, the two pieces no longer resembling one connected aircraft at all. Here is the part that should genuinely surprise you. Most of that fuselage survived. To anyone unfamiliar with how a large aircraft structure actually works, that might look like the strike came up short, damage instead of destruction. Aviation engineers who assessed the wreckage reached the opposite conclusion entirely. A 295 without its tail is not a damaged aircraft waiting on repair parts. It is scrap, permanently, because the specific manufacturing expertise, tooling, and structural knowledge required to rebuild that exact section from nothing does not exist anywhere still operating inside Russia today. The airframe looking mostly whole meant nothing. What actually determines whether an aircraft flies again was gone. There is a brutal efficiency hiding inside that targeting choice. A warhead landing in the middle of the fuselage might start a fire, might ground the aircraft for months, while parts get cannibalized from some other retired airframe sitting in storage. A warhead severing the tail instead removes the one section Russia's remaining industrial base genuinely cannot reproduce, turning what could have been an expensive but survivable setback into total, permanent loss. Using the exact same size drone and the exact same size warhead it would have taken to inflict far less lasting damage almost anywhere else on that same aircraft. Whether that specific aim point was chosen deliberately in advance or simply where the drone's terminal guidance happened to lock on in the final seconds, the outcome lands the same way either time. The single most valuable few square meters of that entire airframe were exactly the few square meters that came off. And there was a second target hiding inside the first one. Intelligence gathered ahead of the strike indicated this specific bomber had already been prepared to carry Kh-101 cruise missiles for a future strike against Ukrainian cities. The same weapon this exact aircraft type has delivered against Ukraine throughout this entire war. Destroying the bomber did not just remove one airframe from an already shrinking fleet, it erased in the same instant whatever mission that aircraft had been loaded and readied for. Those missiles never left Russian soil attached to a platform capable of delivering them, at least not that night. That is a form of protection that never shows up in any casualty count, precisely because the attack it quietly prevented never got the chance to happen at all. None of this required Ukraine to invent some breakthrough new weapon or discover some hidden flaw nobody had noticed before. Every individual piece of this operation, cheap drones built from simple materials, decoys deliberately mixed among real strikes, overwhelming a defense network by handing it more to process than it could cleanly manage in the time available, had already been proven in other operations across this war. What made this particular mission matter wasn't novelty, it was the target, and what losing that one specific target actually costs a country that cannot simply order a replacement built. Sit with the actual numbers for a second, because they are almost absurd when placed side by side. A single Batyar costs a few $1,000s. The Tu-95 it destroyed was worth, by most estimates, somewhere in the tens of millions. And that figure understates the real cost once you account for the fact that money literally cannot buy Russia a new one. A tank destroyed today is one of several hundred still rolling off a production line somewhere this year. A Tu-95 destroyed today is one of a small, fixed, permanently shrinking number that will never again include a newly manufactured example, no matter how much Russia is willing to spend trying to prove otherwise. The math gets even more lopsided once you fold the decoys back into it. 12 drones flew toward Engels that night. Only 6 were armed. The combined cost of building all 12 together likely came in well under the price of a single modern air defense interceptor missile. Russia spent real missiles, real fire control time, and real trained attention shooting down some fraction of those 12, at a cost per intercept that almost certainly exceeded whatever Ukraine spent building the entire package, armed drones and empty decoys combined. Even the successful intercepts that night weren't really a win, not in any way that actually favors the side doing the defending, because this specific exchange rate, cheap expendable attackers against expensive limited interceptors, almost never favors the defender, no matter how many of the attackers get stopped before reaching anything. Scale that same math up across the full 400 drone operation spanning 18 regions, and the imbalance stops looking like an unusual outcome from one unlucky night and starts looking like a structural problem Russia has no obvious way to solve through spending alone. Every additional interceptor purchased to counter this threat is itself vastly more expensive than the drones it is meant to stop, which means the side building cheap drones can, in theory, keep forcing this exact exchange rate indefinitely, while the side buying expensive interceptors is the one actually running out of runway first. This was also, quietly, the third time this year Engels had been hit. Not the first warning, not an isolated lapse in an otherwise airtight defense. A pattern, repeating against a base that had already been reinforced once, patrolled more heavily, expanded, dispersed, and hit anyway, because the specific method changes every time, while the underlying vulnerability never actually does. Each previous strike had prompted the same public response: promises of stronger defenses, visible construction of new infrastructure, renewed patrols, and each time, the base got hit again regardless, not because the improvements were fake, but because they were always aimed at the last attack rather than the next one. That is the pattern worth sitting with longer than any single night's damage report. A defender responding to the previous method of attack is always, by definition, one step behind an attacker who has already moved on to the next one. Spiderweb taught Russia to watch for smuggled ground launches. This strike taught nothing new about method at all, because it didn't need to. It simply proved that watching harder for the last trick doesn't protect you from a slightly different arrangement of the same basic tools: cheap drones, deliberate deception, and overwhelming numbers, aimed at exactly the same underlying weakness that was never actually fixed. Every Tu-95 and Tu-160 Russia still has scattered across its remaining strategic air bases is sitting behind exactly the same exposure Engels just proved was never closed, no matter how much time and how many reinforced defenses have gone into the effort since Spiderweb. Distance helped, right up until 400 drones across 18 regions and 12 carefully split decoys and warheads proved it was never enough on its own. Hardened shelters might help further, assuming Russia can build them fast enough, at the right scale, before the next 12 drones find whichever base still has an airframe sitting exposed on open tarmac that night. What does not change, no matter how much defense gets layered around what remains of this fleet, is how many new Tu-95s Russia can build this year to replace whatever it loses next. That number is zero. It has been zero since 1992, and it is going to stay zero for as long as this war keeps finding ways to reach the aircraft that number was always protecting. Every base still holding one of these bombers is, in effect, running out a clock it has no way to reset. Watching a fleet that can only ever get smaller from here try to survive against an enemy that keeps finding new ways to make it smaller faster. What do you think? Is Russia's strategic bomber fleet now just a shrinking, irreplaceable target list, or can hardened shelters and better air defense actually turn this around before there's nothing left to protect? Let us know in the comments below.